The wind whipped across the plains of western Kansas like it had a grudge. It rattled the tin roof of Luke Harlan's aging farmhouse and tugged at the front screen door as if daring him to keep it closed. He pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders, grit of frost and soil under his fingernails, and squinted at the pile of logs he had dragged from the shed earlier that morning. Neighbors were already lining their driveways, leaning against trucks and shivering in scarves, sipping coffee that steamed like little defiant flags against the cold. Luke didn't notice them at first. His attention was on the logs, each rough cut and weathered, their bark chipped in places, the ends showing splinters where he'd hacked with an old chainsaw that hummed and shivered in the cold. He measured each log with the eye of someone who'd fixed barns since he was 16, years of trial and error, of leaning against gravity and winning. He placed the first log down with a thud that reverberated across the frost-hardened grass, then another, forming a rough line parallel to the house's front porch. Benny Thompson, who lived across the dirt road, took a sip of his coffee and called out, "Luke, you building a fort for squirrels now?" Luke glanced up and shrugged, something like that. "Looks like a crooked fence if you ask me," Benny added, eyebrows raised. Luke ignored the jab. He had heard worse. He had lived with worse, drafts that cut through the house like knives, heating bills that climbed faster than the wind could whistle, winters that left him shivering in the corners despite layers of blankets, old windows, and that ridiculous foam insulation he'd tried one year. None of it worked. He'd spent nights awake in the kitchen, huddled over a tiny stove, watching the thermometer dip and wondering how the wind could mock him so mercilessly. This was different. He had an idea, one he'd carried in his chest since his grandfather's words echoed back from the past. "Stone and timber, boy. Stack 'em right and the wind can't eat your fire." He remembered sitting on the old porch, 12 years old, listening half-heartedly while his grandfather smoked a corncob pipe, eyes squinting at the horizon. He hadn't understood then. He understood now. By dusk, 2 rough walls had risen 4 feet high, running parallel a few feet apart. Luke knelt between them, wedging stones into the narrow gap, smooth river stones, uneven chunks of limestone, all scavenged from the creek behind the property. Each stone he placed was deliberate, the weight pressing into the earth, absorbing the small tremor of the wind that snuck through the skeletal trees. He stacked, pressed, and adjusted, feeling a strange rhythm, almost like a conversation with the elements themselves. The neighbors watched, curiosity overtaking the initial amusement. 2 women and a man had shuffled closer now, eyes wide. "You're insane," Benny said finally, kicking a loose stone. "That wind'll just laugh at you." Luke looked up, tired but steady. "Let it try." The first night came fast. The wind roared across the plains, tearing at the old farmhouse like it remembered every year it had left Luke shivering. He lit the stove and sat, arms crossed, listening. The house groaned and rattled, but the air inside the corridor of stone and timber was still quiet, almost serene. Subtle warmth started to settle, a gentle pressure that hadn't existed before. Luke closed his eyes, letting it seep into him. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Morning brought frost glinting on the edges of the log walls, each stone catching the pale sunlight like tiny embers imprisoned in winter. Neighbors cautiously approached, no longer laughing. Benny's mouth hung open. "Holy hell," he whispered, watching the wind curve around the stone-filled corridor instead of blasting straight through. Martha Keene, who lived 3 doors down, stepped closer, scarf flapping. "You're telling me this keeps the house warm?" Luke nodded. "It holds the heat, physics and patience, that's all." The next days were a study in endurance. The walls trapped warmth effectively, but Luke discovered nuances he hadn't anticipated. Some corners of the kitchen became cozy little ovens, while hallways toward the bedrooms remained stubbornly cold. He adjusted the stones, widened gaps to encourage subtle airflow, learning to manipulate heat like a conductor with an orchestra. The neighbors' skepticism faded into awe. Some offered help, others simply watched, reluctant to disturb what looked like a fragile miracle. Luke demonstrated the method, showing how to wedge each stone, balance logs, and respect the wind rather than fighting it head-on. "You've got to respect the wind," he said one afternoon, hands grimy, eyes sharp. "It's not just cold air, it's force, persistence. It'll find weakness if you give it one." Martha nodded, eyes thoughtful. I think you just told us how to fight an enemy we've always accepted. Luke smiled faintly, or at least how to make it wait its turn. Evenings were the hardest. The wind howled like a beast, hurling snow across the plains, tugging at every board and loose stone. But the walls held. The kitchen warmed, spreading through the small house in a steady, controlled current. Luke leaned against the doorframe, tired, fingers blistered, and felt that rare, private satisfaction, a victory that could be measured in warmth rather than applause. Word traveled fast. By midweek, neighbors stopped by to peek, some still skeptical, some quietly hopeful. They watched Luke test the structure against gusts, saw stones shift but not fall, logs bend but not break. And slowly admiration replaced mockery. Then came the first real test, a gale that roared across the fields, lifting dry grass and rattling every fence post. Luke braced at the doorway, watching as the walls flexed under pressure. The air inside remained gentle, warm. He adjusted a loose stone, pressed a log tighter, and the wind, as if realizing it had met resistance it couldn't break, curved around the corridor and moved on. That night Luke sat by the stove, pen and notebook in hand, sketching diagrams of walls, angles, stone placement, airflow. Every gust, every tremor of logs and stones became a lesson. He realized warmth was earned, controlled, negotiated. And somewhere deep in that quiet, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Outside, the wind continued its howl across the plains, relentless and patient. But inside, Luke Carter's home, imperfect, crooked, and homemade, held heat like a secret treasure. And for the first time in a long, bitter winter, he felt he was winning, not against people, not against neighbors, but against winter itself. The laughter of neighbors faded. Curiosity remained. And somewhere between the logs and stones, Luke knew he had found something larger than warmth: control, ingenuity, and a stubborn courage that no storm could steal. The next morning, the wind had shifted from a teasing slap to a persistent, gnawing howl. Frost clung to every surface, sparkling like fractured glass in the pale sun, and the snow had hardened into a crusted expanse that crunched beneath Luke's boots as he stepped outside. He paused on the porch, surveying his walls. They had held overnight, the stones snug, the logs firm, but he knew winter would not be so forgiving for long. The wind didn't give warnings. It tested, it probed, it struck without mercy. Benny Thompson appeared across the road, his breath fogging the air, gloves stuffed in pockets, a sheepish grin on his face. "I didn't think they'd actually hold," he admitted. "I mean, I still don't understand how you did it, but well, they worked." Luke nodded, rubbing the grit from his palms. "It's not magic, just respect for the wind and patience. You can't force it, you redirect it." Benny's eyes flicked toward the neighboring yards. "So, are we supposed to do this too? Just build walls and pile stones?" "Exactly that," Luke said. "But you have to pay attention. Angle, weight, gaps, every stone matters. One mistake and it's wasted effort." By mid-morning, curiosity had drawn more neighbors out of their houses. Some hesitated at the edge of their driveways, scanning the snow-blown landscape as if it might attack them, while others carried tools, logs, or stones, emboldened by Luke's success. There was a cautious sense of excitement under the cold, a whispered hope threading through shivering shoulders. Luke rolled up his sleeves, shaking snow from his coat, and set to work demonstrating. "You see this?" he said, lifting a fist-sized stone. "If it tilts too far forward, it won't lock with the others. It'll shift under pressure and the wall becomes useless. Watch the gap here between logs, too narrow and the wind escapes around it, too wide and it pushes straight through." He showed them over and over, adjusting, stacking, testing. Hands grew red, nails split from gripping logs, and gloves tore, but slowly, methodically, small walls began to rise along several yards. Each one was imperfect, crooked in places, uneven, but the method was sound. The wind, however, was growing bolder. By afternoon, it had picked up a bite that made the cheeks ache and eyes water. Luke's hair whipped against his forehead as he pressed another stone into a stubborn gap, the gust trying to wrestle it free. Snow swirled in chaotic eddies, hurling flakes and ice crystals like missiles across the plains. "Luke," a voice shouted over the roar. It was Tom Renshaw, struggling to brace a leaning section of wall in his yard. His son clung to his leg, wide-eyed and shivering. "This wind, it's insane." Luke sprinted across the snow, boots sinking deep, body angled against the gale. He grabbed the timber Tom had propped loosely, pressing it tight, and slotted a heavy stone into place. The wind tugged, hissed, and slammed against the barrier, but or the first time Luke saw it hesitate, curve around instead of barreling straight through. "Hold it steady," Luke yelled. "Don't let it push you back." Minutes became hours. Snow built into drifts along the walls, hammering against the timbers, but the basic structures survived. Luke's voice became hoarse from shouting instructions, and his hands were raw and blistered, yet he kept moving, measuring, stacking, adjusting. Martha Keene's situation was even more precarious. One corner of her wall had collapsed in the early morning gusts, stones scattered, logs leaning dangerously. Luke reached her yard just as the wind whipped a loose board toward her, shoving her back. He grabbed the timber, steadied her, and together they rebuilt, stone by stone, brace by brace. Her youngest grandchild clung to her side, teeth chattering, eyes wide with fear. "We'll get it," Luke yelled, voice steady despite the storm. "Just hold tight." Hours dragged on. The wind tested every wall, exploiting weak points, twisting the timber, rattling stones. Luke and the neighbors labored, soaked, frozen, exhausted, yet inch by inch they gained ground. Sweat mingled with snow melt, freezing into ice along the collars of coats, hands numb, bodies aching. But progress was visible. The walls leaned, swayed, groaned, but they did not fall. Heat from stoves and furnaces seeped through the houses, wrapping families in warmth that had been absent for years. Through the chaos, something remarkable happened. The neighbors began to work together instinctively. Benny and Tom hoisted logs while Luke guided the placement of stones. Martha's grandchild, wrapped in an extra blanket, fetched smaller rocks, helping in tiny, careful ways. Instructions flew over the roar of the wind, shouted and gestured, punctuated by the occasional bark of laughter or a curse as frost-bitten fingers slipped. By twilight, the storm had intensified. Visibility dropped to near zero, snow drifts became walls of white that obscured fences, cars, and yard markers. Luke paused for a moment, back pressed against a brace, heart hammering, chest heaving. Every wall was tested to its limit, yet the structures held. The heat inside the houses was no longer tentative. It had weight, substance, presence. A cry cut through the wind. Luke's eyes snapped toward Martha's house. Another section of her wall had collapsed. Snow poured into the yard, whipping around her as she tried to shield herself and the child. Without hesitation, Luke charged into the flurry, grabbed her, and pressed her against his chest while securing a brace against the gust. "We're going to fix it," he shouted. "Hold on." Together they rebuilt the corner, logs wedged, stones pressed into place, the wind testing them with relentless force. Slowly, painstakingly, the wall rose again, sturdier than before. Luke's gloves were shredded, his back screamed, and ice crusted over his hair, but the sight of the standing wall against the gale brought a flicker of triumph. By midnight, exhaustion threatened to claim him. Fingers were stiff, muscles trembling, boots wet and frozen to the ground. But the walls stood. Heat, once squandered, now pooled in steady currents, filling kitchens and hallways, curling around corners, touching the smallest, most vulnerable bodies in the homes behind them. Families huddled together, finally protected from the storm's fury. Tom leaned against a rebuilt section, chest heaving, eyes wet. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "I thought we'd freeze for sure. You saved us." Luke shook his head, too weary to speak. He merely nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and relief in equal measure. Martha approached, voice low, eyes wide. "Luke, I don't know how to thank you. My house, my family, we would have been frozen solid." "You did the work too," he murmured. "We all did. Just followed the wind, listened to it, worked with it instead of against it." Outside, the storm raged on, unrelenting. Yet for the first time, the wind was negotiating, not ruling. Every log, every stone, every brace mattered. Each house became a miniature fortress, and the effort had built something larger than warmth, trust, connection, and the knowledge that survival was possible when people worked together. Exhausted, soaked, and frozen to the bone, Luke finally returned to his own home. He collapsed near the stove, letting the heat seep into limbs that had been numb for hours. Through the window, he watched the log walls outside, stones catching faint moonlight, bending slightly under the wind but unyielding. This night had been more than a test of ingenuity. It had been a test of courage, endurance, and leadership. Neighbors had learned firsthand that persistence and cleverness could outlast even the fiercest storm. Laughter had vanished, replaced by awe, gratitude, and quiet respect. Luke knew the battle wasn't over. Winter would test them again. Storms would come colder and fiercer, each gust could reveal a weakness, each night could be a trial. But now he had proof. Heat could be captured, wind could be tamed, and walls, no matter how humble, could shield more than bodies, they could shield hope. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, sweat and snow crusted into a frozen mask on his hair and eyebrows, Luke Carter realized something vital. He could face the next storm. He could protect not just himself, but others. And somewhere deep in the cold, hard night, that knowledge felt warmer than any fire. The dawn that followed was deceptively calm. The wind had eased to a sullen whisper, threading through skeletal trees and lifting loose snow in lazy spirals. The sun hovered low on the horizon, pale and diffuse, casting long, trembling shadows across the frost-blanketed fields. Luke Carter stepped onto his porch, boots crunching into the icy crust of hardened snow, and surveyed the log walls he had built with his own hands. Each timber and stone bore the weight of the previous night's battle. They leaned slightly, imperfect but unyielding. They had survived. But Luke knew better than to mistake this morning for victory. Storms like the one that had raged yesterday were rarely content to strike once. Winter had patience, and it waited for complacency. The neighbors had begun emerging, shivering and blinking against the pale light, curiosity and exhaustion etched into their faces. Benny Thompson was first, shuffling across the road like a man reconciling awe with disbelief. "I don't know how you," Benny began, but the words caught in his throat as Luke shook his head and pointed toward the horizon. "Don't celebrate yet. That storm was just a preview. It will come again stronger." Benny squinted, snow crusting the brim of his hat. "Stronger than last night? That was insane." Luke nodded solemnly. "Yes, and next time it'll test every wall, every stone, every brace. We're not done." By mid-morning, the neighbors had mobilized again. Some were hesitant, dragging their feet through the snow, unsure if yesterday's lesson had sunk in. Others, like Tom and Martha, moved with quiet determination, gathering tools, logs, and stones as if preparing for a siege. Luke walked between yards, inspecting weak points, offering guidance, his hands raw and blistered, cheeks stung by frost. "See this?" he said, crouching beside a small gap in a neighbor's wall. "Angle matters. If the wind hits this just so, it'll wedge itself between logs and knock them loose. Adjust the stones, balance the logs, and the wall breathes with the wind instead of fighting it. You have to respect it." Hours passed in a blur of motion. The wind, though less aggressive, still carried a bite that made eyes water and noses run. Stones clinked against timber, logs groaned as neighbors struggled to lift them into place. Gloves tore, fingers bled. Breath came in sharp, misted puffs, and yet progress was undeniable. Walls were rising, sprawling, connecting yards in a latticework of timber and stone. Luke paused at his own wall, testing the fit of a heavy stone. The wind tugged at it insistently, trying to pry it free, but it held. A small sense of triumph sparked in him. Each stone pressed into place was a negotiation, a small victory over the elements. He could feel the warmth from the previous night lingering in the house, flowing behind the logs and stones like a tide restrained but patient. By late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather once more. The horizon dimmed to a slate gray and the air grew taut with promise. Luke's stomach tightened. He had feared this. He turned to the neighbors who had begun retreating to their homes for brief respite. "Get inside," he called, voice tight with urgency. "This one isn't gentle. Reinforce what you can. Take blankets, fuel your stoves. We're in for a long night." The first gust hit before sunset. It was a roar, a slash of cold that cut across the plains with precision, lifting snow in jagged sheets, hurling ice against walls with brute insistence. Luke braced himself at his own wall, hands gripping timber, boots dug into the crusted snow. The stones rattled under the pressure, but they did not yield. Across the road, chaos erupted. A neighbor's wall, incomplete and crooked, groaned under the wind. Logs slipped, stones tumbled. Tom and Luke ran to stabilize it, pressing beams, wedging stones, shouting over the roar. The cold bit through gloves and coats, stinging skin and numbing fingers. Inside the house, the warmth was palpable, a sanctuary against the storm, but Luke could hear the groan of the structure under strain, the whistle of wind finding weak points. He pressed his hand to the nearest log, feeling it flex slightly. It held. It must hold. Hours stretched like a frozen eternity. Snow drifted over the walls in waves, piling high against logs and stones. Visibility dropped to near zero. Every gust was a test, probing for weakness, seeking the tiniest error. Luke's muscles, Ock. Ed, his face stung from frostbite creeping across cheeks and nose, but he moved relentlessly, adjusting, pressing, reinforcing. Martha's house became a focal point of the struggle. A corner of her wall had collapsed partially, leaving a funnel for wind to pour into the living room. Luke sprinted across the drifted snow, grabbed a brace, and held it while she wedged stones into the gap. The child clung to her back, teeth chattering, eyes wide with fear. "We'll get it," Luke shouted. "Just keep steady." The neighbors, initially scattered, rallied. Some brought logs, some stones, others shouted instructions. Every small victory was met with brief relief, every failure a sharp pang of fear and frustration. Luke's voice became hoarse from commanding, explaining, encouraging. Sweat froze on his hairline, snow and sleet plastered his coat, but he continued. By midnight, the storm reached its peak. Snow lashed in horizontal sheets, gusts twisted timber, and the neighbors' walls flexed violently. Luke's own wall shivered under the wind, stones rattling, logs groaning. But it did not collapse. Heat flowed behind it, trapped and patient, offering sanctuary to those inside. Families huddled together, feeling warmth seep through floors and walls, a fragile comfort amidst chaos. Luke's exhaustion was total. Fingers numb, muscles screaming, body trembling, he refused to stop. Every section of wall mattered. Each stone pressed into place was a life shielded. Each brace secured a small triumph over the relentless winter. The storm roared like a living thing, but the walls, every wall, held. By the early hours of morning, visibility was almost nil, snow piled high, wind shrieking. Luke leaned against a brace, chest heaving, eyes scanning the expanse of logs and stones he had helped craft. The houses behind them radiated warmth, heat pooling in kitchens, curling around corners, moving with intent. Families were safe, at least for now. Tom, drenched and exhausted, leaned heavily on a rebuilt section of wall. I don't know how you do it," he gasped. "I thought we'd freeze. You saved us." Luke shook his head, too weary to respond in words. Relief and responsibility pressed equally against his chest. He nodded once and moved on, reinforcing a section that had shifted, checking a gap that threatened to funnel wind. Outside, the storm still raged. It would not surrender quickly. But the walls, crude, crooked, imperfect, were standing. Heat flowed, hope endured, and the community, bonded in struggle, had discovered something essential, resilience born from courage and ingenuity. By the faint first light of dawn, the storm began to subside. The wind hissed low and angry, snow piled high, but no longer whipped in chaotic sheets. Luke stood on the porch, exhausted, frostbitten, frozen to the bone, and gazed across the snow-laden expanse. His walls had held. The neighbors' walls, rebuilt and reinforced, had held, and behind every log and stone, warmth and hope had endured. Luke Carter allowed himself a moment to breathe, letting the realization settle like heat behind the logs. They had survived the fiercest test yet, but winter was far from over. The plains would challenge them again, storms would come stronger, and every small error could still prove costly. Yet in the midst of fatigue and frostbite, a fierce sense of triumph surged. They had faced the storm, defied the wind, and carved warmth from the merciless cold. And Luke, standing tall amidst the drifting snow and battered walls, knew that whatever came next, they would meet it together, armed with knowledge, persistence, and courage. The morning after the storm broke was almost unreal. The world lay flattened beneath a blanket of glimmering snow, every tree branch etched with frost, every fence post tipped in white. The wind had calmed to a cautious murmur, threading through the skeletal plains as if testing whether humans had earned a temporary truce. Luke Carter stepped onto his porch, boots crunching across the hardened crust, and surveyed the scene. The log and stone walls stood firm, stubborn, and resilient, each timber leaning with quiet determination, each stone snug in its carefully chosen place. They were imperfect, yes, but alive with purpose. Neighbors began to emerge slowly, blinking against the pale sunlight, faces wind-burned but eyes alight with relief. Benny Thompson was first, shuffling across the road, still half in disbelief. I don't know what to say," he admitted, voice gravelly. "If it weren't for these walls, we'd have been frozen solid." His gaze lingered on Luke's creation, then across the yards where others had followed suit, forming a patchwork defense of timber and stone. "You saved us," he said simply, almost as if saying it aloud would make it real. Luke shrugged, brushing snow off his coat. "We all did," he said. "Just followed the wind, worked with it instead of against it." He had learned long ago that victories shared were stronger than those claimed alone. And this was more than a personal triumph. It was survival, sculpted by hands raw from labor and frostbite alike, tempered by patience and stubbornness. Martha Keene came next, leading her grandchildren through the drifts, their small faces pink from cold, eyes wide with awe. She wrapped Luke in a brief, firm hug. "You saved my house, my family. I don't know how to thank you." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady, filled with gratitude that went deeper than words could reach. Luke simply nodded, letting the warmth of her presence and the quiet approval of the others settle into him. He had fought for more than heat. He had fought for hope. By mid-morning, the scene had transformed into something almost celebratory. Neighbors inspected each other's walls, offering tips, sharing stories of what had held and what had nearly failed. Small triumphs and minor failures were acknowledged in equal measure, laughter threading through the crisp air. The mockery and skepticism of weeks past were gone, replaced by curiosity, respect, and cautious pride. Families peeked through frosted windows, seeing the fruits of collective effort, recognizing that survival could be crafted by human hands and ingenuity. Luke moved among them, offering guidance where needed, adjusting a brace here, demonstrating the correct wedge of a stone there. The wind still whispered against logs and stones, testing patience but no longer dominated. It had become a participant, a measured opponent, rather than a merciless ruler. And slowly, imperceptibly, the community began to understand what Luke had known all along. Warmth, safety, and survival were not given. They were earned, constructed with care, and defended with courage. By noon, word of the success had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Curious visitors arrived from nearby valleys, snapping photos, jotting notes, and hovering like students of some unexpected class in resilience. Luke found himself explaining angles, airflow, stone placement, and the subtle, almost invisible math of winterproofing a home. Each explanation was met with nods of understanding, some incredulous, others inspired. He spoke deliberately, carefully, mindful that these lessons could save lives in storms yet to come. County Inspector Susan Mayer arrived mid-afternoon, her boots crunching softly over snow. She circled Luke's wall, tapping a brace, examining the meticulous placement of stones, and nodded slowly. "This is solid," she said, her professional tone tinged with something close to admiration. "You should document it. Could help a lot of people next winter." Luke merely shrugged, faintly smiling. Documentation had never been his priority, survival had, but he knew she was right. The method, the lessons, the stubborn ingenuity, they were worth sharing. As the day progressed, families began to move beyond mere relief. They began to adapt, to internalize the patterns Luke had shown them, to anticipate the wind, to reinforce walls with confidence. The shared labor of survival had built something far more enduring than timber and stone. It had built trust, camaraderie, and a sense of agency in the face of forces far larger than any one individual. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over snow-laden fields, illuminating the log walls with a soft golden glow. Luke stood on his porch, surveying the neighborhood he had helped fortify. Lights flickered warmly behind frosted windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint laughter of children echoed across the crisp air. The storm had tested them, but now a fragile calm held sway. Winter's bite was still present, but it had been tempered. Humanity had met it and held firm. Martha approached again, this time bringing a loaf of bread and a steaming thermos. "You've done more than protect homes," she said quietly. "You've reminded us what it means to endure, to care for each other." Luke accepted the bread, nodding. Words felt inadequate to describe the fullness of the moment, the relief, the triumph, the bond forged in frost and fire. Later, as the neighborhood quieted and families retreated to the warmth of their stoves and furnaces, Luke returned to his own house. He sat by the stove, letting its gentle heat seep into his tired limbs, reflecting on the past day's labor. The walls outside, crooked yet steadfast, stood as sentinels against the wind, guardians of warmth and life. He pressed his hand to the nearest log, feeling the subtle pulse of heat behind it, and a quiet satisfaction filled him. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. Every gust, every flinch of timber, every shifted stone had left an imprint on his mind. Luke realized that preparedness was not a one-time effort, but a continuous negotiation with nature, patience, and ingenuity. But now, at least for the moment, they had survived. And in that survival was a profound victory, proof that courage, knowledge, and elaboration could bend even the harshest winter to human will. As night descended, snow settling into crystalline drifts, Luke stepped onto the porch one last time. The horizon was a palette of muted purples and grays, the wind a gentle murmur now, testing only faintly as if acknowledging its temporary defeat. The log walls stood firm, their imperfect geometry a testament to human perseverance. Lights glowed softly from the houses behind them, warmth radiating into the long, cold night. Families slept, safe and steady, behind walls that had been built with hands raw from labor but hearts full of resolve. Luke closed his eyes, breathing in the sharp, clean air, feeling the warmth behind every stone, every log, every careful placement. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The battle with winter was far from over. Storms would come, cold would press relentlessly, the wind would seek weakness. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet certainty. He, his neighbors, and the walls they had built together could endure. They had reclaimed a measure of control, warmth, and hope in a world ruled by relentless cold. He stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, letting the quiet envelop the room. Outside, the wind whispered against logs and stones, but it no longer ruled. Not tonight. Not here. The storm had tested them, but humanity had answered with ingenuity, courage, and stubborn resolve. And sometimes, Luke thought as he settled by the stove, that was enough to hold the cold at bay, not just for the body, but for the spirit. And in that moment, Luke Carter felt at last a deep, resonant peace. The walls had held. The families were safe. The lessons had been learned. The laughter, the struggle, the shared endurance, all of it crystallized into a quiet, cinematic triumph. Warmth preserved, community strengthened, and hope secured against the harsh, unyielding winter.